Good evening and welcome to the online Singapore Book Fair organized by Singapore Press Holdings Chinese Media Group. Our book sharing session today is with Professor Kishore Mahbubani, and he's going to talk about his latest book, Has China Won? The Chinese Challenge to American Primacy. The Chinese edition of this book, 中国的选择：中美博弈与战略抉择 is translated by 全球化智库 Center for China and Globalization and will be published by 中信出版集团 CITIC Press. The book launch date for the Chinese edition will be announced soon. Well, we are very honored to have Professor Mahbubani with us this evening. Professor Mahbubani, he's a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. He's a career diplomat and an academic, as well as a prolific writer who has written 8 books and spoken in many corners of the world. Professor Mahbubani was also twice Singapore's ambassador to the UN and served as president of the UN Security Council in January 2001 and May 2002. He was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and an honorary international member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Well, our discussion today will be in English, but you can also listen into the Chinese interpretation of today's session. And you are welcome to raise questions using the Q&A function. You can type in your questions under the Q&A function. But the question and answer session with the audience will be at the end of our discussion. Well, thank you, Professor Mahbubani, for joining us this evening, and we look forward to all your comments on China-US relations and global politics. Well, Professor, I have read your book, and I found the title of the book very interesting and very intriguing. Well, the title of the book is Has China Won? Well, 3 years ago, you also published the book, Has the West Lost It? Well, from the titles alone, this competition between China and the West, or the US, appears to be a zero-sum game where there could be only one winner. Now, I'm just wondering why these titles, and could there only be one winner?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's such a pleasure to join the Singapore Book Fair and to talk about my book. And I'm very happy that you highlighted the words zero-sum game, because, you know, it definitely gives the impression, and my titles do give the impression that I seem to be a sort of against the West, opposed to the West, an enemy of the West. But in reality, you read my books, I think I'm probably the best friend that the West has in the world. And I want to say this quite honestly and sincerely, because my goal is to help the West and not to destroy the West. But at the same time, to help the West has got to understand that the past 200 years of Western domination of world history is an aberration. That's the big message I'm making when I say, has China won? Has the West lost it? I'm basically saying that for the past 200 years, the West had an amazing run. But before that, before 1820, for 1800 of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So the past 200 years meant 2 very small geographical territories, Europe and North America, basically, you know, like literally conquered, colonized, dominated the world for 200 years. So the West sort of assumes that that's the normal pattern of history. So what I'm telling the West is that what they see as the normal pattern of history is an abnormal pattern of history. So in the 21st century, you're going to see the return to the normal and the return of China, India, and the rest of the world. And the West, therefore, should make strategic adjustments rather than continue on autopilot. Because if the West continues on autopilot, it will suffer. And I'm trying to actually prevent the West from suffering, and that's the goal of my books.
Mm-hmm. I'm also curious about what kind of identities inform your writing? Are you writing the book from the perspective of a Singaporean diplomat or a Singaporean academic, and hence the book will take on a Singapore perspective? Or do you try to write from the view of promoting the greater good for the humanity and the world? What kind of perspective, what kind of identities inform your writing?
I would say my identities, that's a very interesting question. No one has ever asked me that before. But my identities were forged by two, I would say, critical processes in my life or events in my life. One is I studied Western philosophy. So in some ways, the reason why I can speak the language of the West is because I spent many, many years studying Western philosophy, a subject that I love. And in some ways, the reason why I speak so confidently about where the West is going wrong is that I tell the West, these are your principles, and this is how you're behaving. Excuse me, that's double standards. You've got principles, and you're not behaving that way. So in that sense, again, I'm a friend of the West, as I said earlier. And secondly, I would say my 10.5 years as ambassador to the UN from Singapore, where I had, for 10 years, I met almost every day 193 ambassadors from the UN. So I was very conscious as I walked down the UN corridors that someone from Namibia, someone from Argentina, someone from Mongolia, someone from Estonia, they have a very different view of the world, right? And so I found that one of the greatest learning journeys to say that, hey, actually the world is a very diverse and complex place. And paradoxically, even though Western societies are in theory the most open societies in the world, I always say this, and quite sincerely, the paradox about Western societies is that they have open societies with closed minds. And that's the tragedy. And so my goal is actually to open the Western mind and learn to adapt and live in a world where the West, and this is the key point I must emphasize, the West only makes up 12% of the world's population. 88% of the world lives outside the West. And the West basically doesn't understand these 88% and doesn't understand that, for 200 years, the world had to adapt to the West. Now it's a two-way process, and the West has also got to adapt to the world. And that's a major psychological adjustment that many Western minds, including sadly leading minds in the Western media, find difficult to accept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I read your book, and I saw that you did give the West, especially the US, lots of ideas of how strategic ideas of how they should, improve and all that. But the book was published about a year ago, and that was when the Trump administration was still running the US. And in your book, you pointed out the US strategic mistakes, such as, and you gave them so many, advice. Now that the Biden administration is in place, they are indeed working on some of those advice that you have mentioned, such as working with global allies. We saw that the Quad has held its first summit. And then we also see that recently the European Parliament has reacted by freezing the China-Europe investment deal. And do you think Biden's global strategy and its way of rallying allies to balance China, do you think that has made the world a better place? Do you think it will make the world a better place?
Well, in some ways, the Biden administration has been very good for my book. Because you know what, in paragraph 1 of my book, okay, then this book was written in April 2020, long before Biden was even sort of acknowledged to be the potential winner. And at that time, I said that the U.S. China geopolitical contest was launched in 2018 by Donald Trump, but it will outlast him. It doesn't matter who's elected, the U.S. China geopolitical contest will continue. And as you know, the Biden administration has in many fundamental ways continued the contest. You referred to how they've adjusted to their allies, but at the same time, they haven't removed all the trade tariffs and sanctions. The language on China is still very harsh. There's been no high-level meeting directly between the two presidents, and the famous meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, between Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi on one side, and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan on the other side, as you know, became very acrimonious. So the Biden administration has clearly fulfilled a prediction I made in my book, so I should thank them. But at the same time, I must say, I just heard today a video recording of a conversation with Kurt Campbell, someone whom I met before. And I actually was very encouraged by his remarks. And initially I was a bit worried about his remarks because, you know, I tell you that the press reported that Kurt Campbell is saying that there's no more engagement. So I thought, oh my God, you know, he's taking a hard line. But if you listen to the remarks he made at to a function organized by Stanford University, he said, of course, competition will continue, no more engagement, but they emphasize it's peaceful competition. There'll be no military clash, which is one positive development, that they'll cooperate where they will have to. And then he made a very important statement that no one has noticed yet. And he said, of course, we're not going to ask countries to choose. That's a very important point I make in my book. Mm-hmm. That most countries in the world want to have good relations with the United States, but they also want to have good relations with China. And as you know, the Trump administration was brutal, you know, very brutal, either on their side or opposed to them. And here I'm beginning to sense now that I think the Biden administration possibly, we don't know yet, could come up with a more thoughtful, intelligent, long-term strategy, which is, of course, I give in my last chapter of my book. That's why I try to give some win-win formulas for U.S. and China to cooperate with each other.
Because I read some Japanese scholars writing for Zaobao and Think China, because it said that, you know, now that Japan is made an ally, because Biden's strategy is to, you know, get the allies together to balance China. It actually makes Japan to be in a more difficult position than before.
Because, definitely. I think definitely, and I think earlier, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned the Quad also.
Yes.
And I think Japan will be put in a very difficult position if the United States tells Japan, you must stand with us against China, because Japan's number one trading partner is not the US anymore, it's China.
Yes.
And so the Japanese will have to pay. And also at the end of the day, the Japanese have to calculate, okay, you know, the good news about Japan-China relations, as you know, there's a very famous Harvard scholar who passed away this year, Ezra Vogel, who wrote a book on China and Japan. And he points out that China and Japan have had the longest continuous relationship of two countries, is China and Japan. He said most of the time they live in peace, right?
That's right.
So, but they've had 50 bad years. From 1895 to 1945, they had 50 bad years. But after that, we can go back to the previous norm. So I think it's important for the Japanese, therefore, to be very careful in how they manage China. And the United States should also be very careful in how it manages Japan and not force Japan to take sides in the US-China contest so very, very blatantly, because at the end of the day, the United States will be in Asia for another 100 years. China will be in Asia for another 1,000 years. So the Japanese must think in terms of 1,000 years.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So do you think the Quad it will be successful in its mission to balance China? Or some will say is a mini NATO, is actually there to contain China. And do you think the Quad how do you think can actually play a better role in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I've actually written about the Quad somewhere, and I don't think the Quad will work as a counterbalance to China, because they all have, their interests are very different. You see, unlike, if this is a mini NATO, as you were saying earlier, what made NATO very strong and cohesive is that the interests were completely aligned. Europe actually was as frightened of the Soviet Union as the United States was. Europe did zero trade with Soviet Union, whereas and they did all their trade with the United States, right? So complete alignment of interests. But today, I mean, Australia's #1 trading partner by far is China. Japan's #1 trading partner is China. I think even for India, the #1 trading partner is China. So it's very difficult to carry out a containment policy against your #1 trading partner for a start. And also their interests are very divergent, and geopolitical, one thing people always forget, that the word geopolitical is a combination of two words, geography and political. Geography is very important, right? So Australia, if Australia was geographically where Canada is, Australia can do whatever it wants to do. But Australia is surrounded by all Asian countries. So Australia has got to psychologically adjust and follow the norms of other Asian countries. And most of them, in one way or another, are trying to get along with China. And I think that the geography of Australia, Japan, and India will lead to them having different policies. But you see at the first Quad high-level meeting, they made a commitment to deliver 1 billion doses of vaccine, right, to Southeast Asia. And I was very happy. I said, great, that's exactly the thing to do. Make the Quad a medical club and deliver vaccines. But as you can tell, the vaccines are not coming. Sadly, I mean, India is now suffering so much that I can completely understand why they can't do it.
All right. Yeah. Going back to your book, another advice that you gave the US in the book is to start considering the situation when it is no longer the world's dominant economic power, or as some people have suggested, when it actually becomes the #2. I'm just wondering, because the US is a very different country from China. Now, as you said in the book, China has a civilization history that goes back thousands of years. And the Chinese, they believe in this history. Whereas the US is actually an immigrant society with just 200 over years of history. So I'm just thinking, when China fell to its bottom, the civilization belief held it together. Whereas the US has always been like the light and the beacon of the world. It has always been forward-looking. So what will happen if it falls to #2? When it is no longer the light, no longer the beacon, then what can it be? What is it?
Well, those are excellent questions. And I'm glad that you emphasized the 4,000 years of Chinese history. Some say 5,000. I'm not an expert. Give or take 1,000 years. The important thing, of course, for United States to understand better is Chinese history. And, in addition to my book, I also produced this year in 2021, MOOC, M-O-O-C, Massive Open Online Course on U.S. China relations, where I emphasize to Americans that you have to understand Chinese history, especially understand the Chinese century of humiliation, if you want to understand why the Chinese are so determined about trying to succeed in the 21st century. They don't want to see a repeat of the century of humiliation. And you're absolutely right that at a time when China really, really was battered in the 19th century by, the British and the Opium War, the Anglo-French sacking of the Summer Palace, and so on and so forth.
Recording in progress.
Yeah. So that is a very positive thing that I tried to, explain to the Americans, that you've got to understand Chinese history.
Yes, the history part.
But in the case of the United States, I want to emphasize that I don't predict the collapse of the United States in any way. In fact, in my book, as you know, I emphasize that the biggest mistake that China could make will be to underestimate the United States in this competition. So I begin the book with a fictional memo from one of President Xi Jinping's colleagues to President Xi, saying, "President Xi, you have launched a big contest against US. We will win. But whatever we do, you must never underestimate the United States." And you must remember, by the way, to be fair, you must be very clear about this. The most successful society since human history began is the United States of America. Okay, they have achieved things that almost no other society has achieved in human history. To give you a simple example, only one country has landed man on the moon, which is the United States. Nobody else has done it. And I think it takes some time before anybody else can do it. So it would be a mistake for China to underestimate the United States. So I expect the United States to remain a very strong, powerful, thriving society with lots of challenges, which you can speak about later on. But at the same time, paradoxically, and this is my big message to the Americans, the United States would actually be better off in a world where it is the number 2 economic power, and it will become the number 2 economic power within 10, 15 years, but it can still remain a very attractive society. And so what makes the United States exceptionally strong is that China cannot attract the best brains from 7.5 billion people to come and live, work, and study in China, but United States can. And you look at Google, it's run by someone born in India, Sundar Pichai. Look at Microsoft, it's run by an Indian guy born in India, Satya Nadella. So you can see the United States still has the capacity to outcompete China in many areas also. So I don't see in that sense, a zero-sum game where China wins and United States loses. Actually, United States can remain very strong, powerful, and vibrant, and in some ways actually become more attractive if it becomes a more humble number 2 power rather than an arrogant number 1 power.
So what you're saying is actually the United States will actually always be very attractive to immigrants, and actually not China. Yeah. Why is that? Why is that so? Because I think that's what I get from what you said just now.
I mean, for a simple example, in China, you first start, you have to learn Chinese.
Okay.
If you don't speak Chinese, you're completely lost in China, obviously. And so you have, and whereas most countries in the world, most people in the world speak English still. And they can go to the United States and become, and in the case of the Chinese society, the Chinese never expect anybody else to become Chinese. They believe that you should keep your culture, you should be who you are. And only Chinese can be Chinese. Whereas the Americans believe anybody can be American. So even I, from Singapore, I can go there. They say, "Oh, we welcome you. You can be an American," right? So there's a very different, so they're very welcoming to immigrants, of course. At the same time, there has been an anti-immigrant backlash, by the way, to some extent in the US too. Yeah. And the US is actually shooting itself in the foot when President Trump canceled the H-1B visas for especially Indian technology workers. And that was a classic case of the United States shooting itself in the foot by denying entry to Indian technology engineers.
Yep. All right. Chapter 4 of your book also has a very interesting title. It says, "Is China expansionist?" And you gave examples in history and cited Chinese philosophers to show that China is non-expansionist, whether it is in action or whether it is in their philosophical thinking. Well, many Chinese will agree with you because they also believe in Chinese peacefulness. And that is also the official narrative because we are always hearing about China's peaceful rise. But why do you think it is believed otherwise in the West and also in parts of Southeast Asia?
Well, I know that that's when I say that China is non-expansionist as a power, it is controversial, it's challenged. If you read the reviews of my book, that's where they criticize me. This is so naive, stupid idiot from Singapore says that China is non-expansionist. I give you a very simple piece of proof, okay? I mean, Australia is so much closer to China than it is to the United Kingdom, the British, right? And yet it was the British who colonized Australia and not the Chinese. Okay. And there was a time, as you know, when Admiral Cheng He had a fleet of ships that were much bigger and much more powerful than the Portuguese. He made several voyages overseas, went up to Africa, and didn't colonize any territories. The Portuguese, with much smaller vessels, came out and, you know, conquered Brazil, in Latin America, conquered Angola, Mozambique, in Africa, took a bite of India in Goa, took a bite of China in Macau. You see, that's the difference, right? Why is it? So clearly there's something in the cultural gene of the Europeans or the West which makes them go out and conquer and colonize the world. And the Chinese haven't shown that tendency. And also, frankly, if you look at it objectively, you're asking which country is more aggressive. China has not fought a war in 40 years, okay? And hasn't fired a bullet in 30 years. And of course, there was this China-India punch-up that sadly led to lots of lives, lots of lives, but they didn't shoot each other, you know? They didn't shoot each other. And by contrast, the United States has, I think, dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs and has actually, according in my book, an estimated, this is from the Brown University Institute, please, not my figures. United States has killed 800,000 civilians in unnecessary wars and actually wasted $5 trillion. So, you know, if you're a social scientist and you believe in data, and the West believes that China is an aggressive country, United States is a peaceful country. But you know, if you're a social scientist, the data shows that China is a peaceful country and United States is an aggressive country. This is just pure data. Okay. So that's why actually one of the key goals of my book is basically to tell the West and tell United States, you know, Napoleon was very wise when he said, let China sleep. For when China awakes, she will shake the world. And the United States, by pushing China so hard, may inadvertently actually create a very angry dragon that wakes up and may suddenly say, okay, you push me enough, I'm now going to teach you a lesson. So I think that's very unwise on the part of American policy and Western policy when they deal with China, and they should be wiser and essentially say, okay, China has not conquered territories overseas. Let's keep it that way, right? And you know, by the way, just another very, very important point. There's a Harvard professor, Graham Allison, who also wrote a book on U.S. China relations called Destined for War. And he has a passage in his book, which I quote. He said, we Americans, we keep wishing that China will be like us, like Americans. He said, stop, be careful what you wish for. Because China in 2021 is where United States was in 1890, when United States was emerging as the #1 power. And what did the United States do? It declared war on Spain, it seized the Philippines, it seized Guam, it conquered the Panama Canal, it fought started fighting so many wars. And so Graham Allison says, do you want China to be like America? Clearly not. So, I mean, these are all these facts of history that most Americans, surprisingly, are not aware of, and they should actually be happy that China has not decided to copy what the West is doing and going out to conquer and colonize the world.
So, for me, from what you say, it seems like it's in the West imagination. Then they are just making out a China in their own image, or what is it?
Well, you're asking a very good question, because the paradox, and this is what the message that my book, Has China Won, Has the West Lost It, is trying to tell the message to the West, is that the West is going through a psychologically painful process of having to accept the fact that they can no longer dominate the world, right? I mean, right now they're losing the domination. So psychologically, when you lose your domination, you feel under stress. And so the West is trying, I guess, making one last ditch effort to say, hey, we are still number one, when in fact they're no longer number one. And by the way, just to emphasize that what I mean, the IMF and World Bank were created, in the late 1940s, right? And you've had a rule then, since then, that says that to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. I mean, that made sense when Europe and America dominated the global economy. But that's no longer true. So the West should gracefully say, okay, we no longer run the global economy. Why don't we let a non-Westerner, maybe let an Indian run the World Bank, let the Chinese run the IMF? But it's impossible. They cannot give it up. And that reluctance to accept the new world is actually unwise. So I'm actually trying to help the West by saying, hey, guys, wake up. You can no longer conquer and dominate the world in the way that you used to. And why don't you just learn to be humble and share power and find ways and means of working with China and not make China very angry?
Is there a way for Chinese to allay such fears of China being expansionist? Do you think it's important for China to allay such fears, or whether it's possible at all?
Absolutely. I think the Chinese should also understand that they have become so big and so fast that they have shaken the global order. And I use a very simple image all the time, just so that people understand. When I began this conversation with you, there was a little cat sitting next to me, right? And then I've been talking to you now for about half an hour. I turned on, the cat has become a tiger, right? We've been talking for 34 minutes.
Yeah.
And in 34 years, the cat has become a tiger. In 1980, China's GNP in purchasing power parity terms was 10% of the United States. And United States, and then by 2014, China had become bigger than the United States. So when the Chinese keep saying, and this is no longer credible, okay, oh, we are a poor developing country. Our per capita income is only 10,000, United States 65. All that is true. But China's economy is so much more powerful and more dynamic in many ways than any other economy in the world, right? China is the world's #1 trading power. So I think it would be good for Chinese to try to do that. And to be fair, the Chinese keep trying to send that signal, that we believe in, Chen Bijian has said that we believe in a peaceful rise and we want to work with the rest of the world. And paradoxically, this is the key point I emphasize. In theory, what China should be doing now should be to overturn the Western created global multilateral order based on the United Nations. China should say, hey, the West created this. I'm going to throw it out, start something new. Ironically, China accepts the Western created global multilateral order centered on the United Nations. It's actually wonderful that China is accepting it, and the West should welcome it. And you had a stupid situation where at the height of the pandemic, China was supporting the World Health Organization, and the United States, we actually helped to create the World Health Organization, and Trump left the WHO.
Yeah.
This is bizarre. It's against Western interests. So yes, the Chinese should send such signals, but they have been sending such signals, like by embracing Western multilateral institutions, and the West hasn't paid attention.
But the West has paid attention to wolf warrior diplomacy. What is your take on that?
Well, I must say my views on wolf warrior diplomacy have evolved. And I'll tell you how they've evolved. Initially, like many in the West, I thought, hey, this is not wise. When you speak so harshly to insult other countries, there'll be a backlash. And there has been a backlash, certainly in the United States, and a backlash in Europe, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it may actually be healthy for the Chinese to actually get angry from time to time when they're insulted. Because, I learned from personal experience, when you try to bottle up your anger, you can bottle up for a while and then you explode. It's like a volcano, right? In some ways, if you want to prevent a major earthquake, you allow little tremors to emerge. So in some ways, it may be psychologically healthy for the Chinese when they get very angry to say, hey, you insulted me. Like, for example, the Australian government calling for a public inquiry into how the COVID-19 started. And that's, I've been a diplomat for 33 years. The ABC of diplomacy is don't insult another country publicly. I mean, you can maybe make a private request or do it carefully, but to publicly call for it, that was Australia slapping China in the face. And so it was natural for China to get angry, right? So in that sense, in sometimes, not all the time, by the way, not all the time. And I would say that wolf warrior diplomacy must be used in very carefully and in a very measured elements against specific cases where clearly China has been insulted. That thing from time to time, but it should not become the dominant pattern of Chinese diplomacy.
You also mentioned the big difference in how the Americans and the Chinese engage the world. You said while the Americans feel that there are universal values and need to promote these values around the world and even encourage other countries to adopt similar systems and institutions as well as ideologies, you said the Chinese do not feel this way. You actually mentioned it just now. You said the Chinese believe that only Chinese can be Chinese in culture, values, and aesthetics. And the Chinese practice a non-interventionist way of engaging the world, not getting involved, especially in foreign military conflicts when it does not serve national interest. However, we also see very interesting comments that there are accusations of the Chinese ways in the sense that China is self-serving. It has no principles. It is willing to work with any government in any country as long as it serves China well and does not act in the interest of humanity. These are also cited as reasons why anti-China protests broke out in Myanmar. What is your advice on this, or what is your advice for major powers about this?
Well, I'm going to give, I was a diplomat for 33 years. And one big lesson I learned from working with, I had a great fortune of working with Singapore's three great leaders, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and Mr. Rajaratnam. And they said for a small country, the biggest danger is to have illusions in geopolitics and to believe that there are, for example, benevolent great powers. The term benevolent great power is an oxymoron. Every great power puts their national interests first. So it doesn't matter if you are United States or Soviet Union, if you're China or India, if you are UK or France, no matter what kind of power you have, you always put your interests first. And if you have to sacrifice your values, you will sacrifice your values. And ironically, when you, as you know, in the year 2021, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the famous visit by Dr. Henry Kissinger to Beijing in July 1971. And I remember reading the newspapers, and there was a love affair between the United States and China, ping pong diplomacy, how good a great country China is. And ironically, in 1971, China had gone through a period where there were far greater human rights abuses in the Great Leap Forward, in the Cultural Revolution, and Americans closed their eyes completely because they said, oh no, we need China as an ally against the Soviet Union. So when it serves the interests of a great power like the United States, and even today, the Americans say they will only work with democracies. They work very well with Saudi Arabia, which is not a democracy. So, you know, this idea that great powers put values first is just not true. And so the behavior of every great power is to put their interests first. Although what makes the West different is that they keep declaring that they believe in values, But you know, ever since I began writing essays, I've been writing essays. One of my first essays in the national interest 30 years ago was called The West and the Rest. I've been documenting Western double standards for 30 years. Maybe one of my last projects is to create an encyclopedia of Western double standards, okay? So it is unwise for the West to pretend that it is in any way more moral than other countries are. They're just normal. All countries are normal. They put their interests first. So if I'll give you a concrete example, the United States has criticized China for not abiding by the decision of the International Tribunal on the South China Sea. It's true, China hasn't complied with it. But you know, a higher body, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, has said that the United States and UK should return Diego Garcia to Mauritius. You know what? The United States says, China, you must obey international law. But United States and UK don't obey international law. So this just happened now, you know. So we as small countries, by the way, I must emphasize, small countries like Singapore must never have any kind of illusion that any kind of great power will sacrifice its interests for them. So anytime they raise human rights, they use it as a geopolitical weapon when it is convenient. And I can give you even more shocking examples of how the Western countries have violated human rights.
What made you start documenting all these double standards? I mean, for 34 years, that's a long time.
And so in the case of China, when China puts its, to answer your question directly, when China puts its national interests first, it's behaving normally as any great power. But of course, it is also in China's national interests to develop good win-win relationships with all its neighbors. And so it can put its national interests first and still help to support. And I would say, to be fair, China has been helpful to many ASEAN countries. And, you know, of course, you mentioned the anti-China demonstrations in Myanmar. But so everybody thinks that the Chinese government is supporting the military government in Myanmar. But actually, the Chinese government was very upset with this coup because they had a very good relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi. And, you know, when China had its last major Belt and Road summit in Beijing, one of the stars at that summit was Aung San Suu Kyi. So the Chinese, you know, people misunderstand where China stands on issues like Myanmar.
Okay. Let's talk about Taiwan. Many scholars and commentators have mentioned that Taiwan is a flashpoint of China-US relations and that the core interests of the two countries are in conflict over the Taiwan issue because the US is the hegemonic country. They say it's raising the flag of justice in the Taiwan Strait, whereas China upholds its right over territorial sovereignty. So it's an issue where none can give way. However, in your book, very interesting, you have encouraged the US to befriend the Kuomintang and let Taiwan and China become one country naturally over time. You have also said that the US should leave issues of the South China Sea to the World Court and not by sending warships to patrol the area. I'm just wondering, how can a hegemonic state who feels that it is exceptional, do those things that you mentioned in the book that you have suggested?
Well, I'm glad you raised the issue of Taiwan. It is by far the most dangerous issue in U.S. China relations. And if there's one issue that can lead to war between the United States and China, it is Taiwan. I think it's important for both sides to understand that, because the Chinese leaders' hands are tied. If any Chinese leader is seen to have, been soft and let Taiwan go, he'll be removed by the Chinese people. So there's a very rock solid consensus in China. But here I want to pay a small tribute to the Biden administration, because one of the most positive things the Biden administration has done, even in the first few months, is that, when the Trump administration was doing many, many anti-China things, we know that. But the most dangerous thing that the Trump administration was doing was trying to change a 50-year, not 50 years, since 1979. After US and China established diplomatic relations, US broke off diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And so the US continued official relations with China and unofficial relations with Taiwan. That was the understanding, and people accepted that. And unfortunately, the Trump administration was trying to change it by sending officials to Taiwan, current officials. And that was a very dangerous thing that the Trump administration was doing. But the one positive thing that the Biden administration has done is that it has, within the first few months, it sent a delegation to Taiwan. It sent the retired Senator Christopher Dodd, sent the retired Deputy Secretary Richard Armitage, sent the retired Deputy Secretary James Steinberg. And I thought that was very good. That was a signal that, okay, we're going to keep on official relations with China and unofficial relations with Taiwan. But that's a positive sign. But I think at the same time, many Americans must ask themselves a very fundamental question. Is it in the interest of the United States to trigger a war with China? Because if you have a nuclear war between two nuclear powers, you don't have a winner and a loser. You have a loser and a loser. Nobody wins a nuclear war. All the studies demonstrate this. So clearly, it is not in America's interest to inadvertently start a war with China. And they got to understand they can inadvertently start a war with China if they try and push Taiwan towards independence. So actually, paradoxically, if the United States want to help the people of Taiwan, and I think there's a genuine concern in the United States for the people of Taiwan, the best way to help the Taiwanese people is to preserve the current status quo. Mm-hmm. The current status quo allows the Taiwanese people to lead their own life, to travel around the whole world. And in fact, the Taiwanese people have a very good quality of life. One of my favorite places I love to visit is Taiwan. I'm amazed how clean Taipei is, cleaner than Singapore, without an army of foreign cleaners. Mm-hmm. So the Taiwanese people have a very good quality of life. And so let's preserve the status quo and not disrupt it, because if you disrupt it, then unfortunately, if a war starts, I think the first people to suffer will be the people of Taiwan.
That's very true. Mm-hmm. But you have also spoken well of President Xi Jinping in your book. You said that he could provide China the beneficent kind of rule provided by a philosopher king. And you said his job is to deliver political stability and economic growth, as well as develop a team of able successors to carry on the good work. How confident are you that China will continue on this path of rise, producing able leaders under the current political and social system?
Well, I think if you look at the end of that chapter, if I remember correctly, I wrote the book a year ago, but I hope I remember correctly. I say that the biggest challenge that China faces, United States faces many challenges. The biggest challenge China faces is leadership succession. Because in China, relies a lot on having good, strong leaders. And China is actually very fortunate that it now has a very strong leader. And in some ways, one reason why President Xi Jinping has been able to consolidate his power so much in China is because the Chinese people are aware that the United States has launched a major geopolitical contest against China. They know that. They can see it, they can feel it. And the Chinese people also, many Chinese people believe that this is the last effort by the West to humiliate China and prevent the rise of China, which is why they read the U.S. China geopolitical contest. And so when you're about to go to battle in probably the biggest challenge that the United States, as I kept emphasizing earlier on, is the most formidable power that human history has produced. It's going to be a major struggle. And if you're going to get engaged in the biggest struggle that China has ever engaged in, do you want a strong leader or a weak leader? The answer is you want a strong leader. And that's why I'm told that that President Xi is extremely popular in China. And even a Harvard Kennedy School study has demonstrated how support for the Chinese government has gone up from 86% in 2003 to 93% in 2016, right? And it's quite natural. When the Chinese people, I keep emphasizing, they've experienced the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. So in that sense, I would say that the Chinese are fortunate that they have a leader like President Xi. And the interesting thing about President Xi is that he also understands the world very well. I was in Davos in January 2017 when he gave his speech on globalization. And there's one paragraph I'll never forget. He says that China, when it decided to embrace globalization, when it plunged into the ocean of globalization, we Chinese, we struggled to swim. We drank a lot of water, right? By the end of the struggle, we became stronger. So at the end of the day, China is very much in favor of globalization. So we live in a very paradoxical world where the whole global trading system, as well as the principles of economics that drive free trade, are all Western principles. They're not Chinese principles.
Yeah.
Today, it is Western societies, including especially the United States of America, which is frightened to sign free trade agreements, and China is ready to sign a free trade agreement with any country in the world, without exception. So that shows you how much sort of accumulated wisdom that has developed in the Chinese system. So you can understand why the Chinese at this stage, when you're facing a major geopolitical contest, when you've had 40 years of exceptional development, why do you want to rock the boat and change of system? It doesn't make sense. And that's why the system in China remains very strong.
But there are scholars outside of China, and including those originally from China, they are concerned with what they feel is a massive left turn by President Xi Jinping. Are you concerned about this?
Well, the paradox about all the scholars who are concerned about this left turn is that many of these scholars are critics of China, right? They're not friends of China. They're critics of China, and they say China is going to destroy itself by becoming more leftist and so on and so forth. If indeed China is going to destroy itself by becoming more leftist, they should be celebrating it. Why are they criticizing China for becoming more leftist? I actually think that clearly in some areas China is becoming more leftist, no question whatsoever. But at the same time, I think the Chinese understand the importance of the private sector and why. And if I'm not mistaken, 65% of the Chinese economy is still comes from private sector companies. Only 35% comes from SOEs. So the balance hasn't changed. And at the same time, when China goes for something like the dual circulation, right? dual circulation means I try to grow my domestic market, but I still continue to rely on the rest of the world. So I think while some of the rhetoric is leftist, the practices have not changed in any way. And so, for example, China is still enthusiastic about the regional comprehensive economic partnership. And what's even more shocking, if China was leftist, would China consider joining the CPTPP, which the United States cannot join? Right? The CPTPP is a very liberal free trade agreement. So you can see how, all these categories that are applied to China, and what makes China different at the end of the day is that the Chinese are very pragmatic. So they'll take a bit of leftists, a bit of rightists, a bit of centrists, and they put it all together in a specific Chinese way. And it seems to work for the Chinese way, and we cannot use it in Singapore. Other countries cannot use it, but China's got to adapt formulas for its own society.
But what about the political left turn? Because I think a lot of scholars, they are more concerned about that, like presidency, removing the term limits, tightening media control, or intensifying ideological indoctrination. That's some of these concerns and issues that they have brought up. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if these things damage China, then the United States should be happy about this, right? I mean, in theory, the criticism that is made of China is that when President Xi removes the term limits, when he emphasizes more Marxist ideology and all that, according to Western theory, he's damaging China. So if he's damaging China, United States should send a thank you note to President Xi, say, thank you very much for damaging China. You are helping us win the struggle. And yet, it doesn't make sense. And yet, it is the critics of China that are attacking him for that. And it's a bit strange. Because, at the same time, if you read my book carefully, one of the most important chapters where I emphasize the point that if this was really a contest within a democracy in the United States and a communist party system in China, the democracy will win. But in that chapter, I describe how the United States has effectively, functionally become a plutocracy, where the very rich make the decisions, and China has become a meritocracy, right? Now, everybody says that it was a mistake for China to go after Ant Financial, right? It wouldn't have happened in the United States. But the reason why it doesn't happen in the United States is because the plutocrats control the political process. And in fact, that's America's biggest competitive disadvantage. And I'm not the one, by the way, who's saying that America is a plutocracy. The late Paul Volcker, the head of the Fed, the most respected head of the Fed, said America has become a plutocracy. And Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate, says that the United States has become a plutocracy. Martin Wolf, of Financial Times, says the United States has become a plutocracy. So if what President Xi is doing is preventing the emergence of a plutocracy in China, then he's enhancing China's competitive advantage over the United States, which has become a plutocracy.
Let's come to the last question that I have for you is about Singapore's position in all these, because now we see that the world is really in a state of flux under the current China-US competition and rivalry. So can you tell us what do you think will be the best scenario or the worst scenario, and how do you think Singapore can prepare for these?
Well, I think, Singapore has been somewhat unusual. Most countries have taken a very low profile, and privately they keep saying, we want to be friends of the United States. Privately, we say we want to be friends of China, but they haven't said things publicly. And what's unusual is that the Prime Minister of Singapore has stated very, very clearly, both in his Shangri-La speech in June 2019, and I was there, and in his Foreign Affairs article in early 2020, that Singapore wants to be good friends of China, Singapore wants to be good friends of US. I think that's also the dominant ASEAN position. So I think that's the approach that Singapore will take. But having said that, I want to emphasize that it will also be very difficult. And in fact, one reason why I wrote this book, Has China Won? I think since Singapore is going to be one of the countries that's most directly affected by this U.S. China geopolitical contest, it's very important for Singaporeans to read this book carefully. Fortunately, many have, by the way. I hope that when the Chinese edition comes out, the Chinese-speaking Singapore population will also read the Chinese edition of the book when it comes out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think, thank you, for your sharing. We have a number of questions online. Let me share the question with you. It's a reader who's very concerned about the investigation of the COVID origin that's initiated by the Biden administration. And he's asking how this investigation, what do you think, how do you think it would affect, geopolitical relationship going forward? Do you think there some kind of results will affect how things will go moving forward?
Well, I think there's absolutely no question that because COVID-19 has really hurt the world very badly, right? We know that. And millions have died. What we have to do is find out what caused it. But to find out what caused it, you must let the scientists do the work and not politicians. Because politicians only use viruses for political purposes to embarrass other countries. Scientists are only interested in the scientific truth. So I have no doubt that if you got a group of scientists, the best scientists in the world, right? From the United States, from Europe, from India, from China, from any countries, to sit down among themselves, the scientists would have a dialogue which is very different from what the politicians would have. They would not focus on blaming each other. They would focus on finding out what were the actual scientific origins of this virus. And the best way to find out is have the scientists working together. And what is sad is that actually there were American scientists based in Wuhan, right? Before COVID-19 broke up. But the Trump administration, as part of its anti-China measures, pulled out the American scientists out of Wuhan. That was unwise, right? So we must go back to a world where there's constant exchanges of scientists, and we should have more scientist to scientist collaboration and less politician to politician finger pointing exercises.
So you think that, having a world organization that's leading this will be better rather than,
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think the World Health Organization should be entrusted to do the job, and with a balanced, objective scientist. So I was watching on BBC an interview, I think she's with a Dutch lady, and this Dutch lady said in response to what President Joe Biden said, she was a member of the team that went to China, by the way. She said if the United States has new evidence that it comes from a lab, it must share the evidence. It cannot keep it to itself. And so this is a Dutch scientist asking the United States, please share your scientific evidence with us.
Mm-hmm. We have another reader. She's very concerned about the critiques on state capitalism. And, there's a lot of criticism about China on unfair trade practices and competition. So what is your view about this?
Well, I think the reader is right. There have been several unfair trade practices on the part of China. So as you know, the chapter 2 of my book, yes, I describe how the biggest strategic mistake that China made was to alienate the American business community, because when Trump launched his trade war, normally it's the American business community who says, stop, you're spoiling my biggest market in China. But as you know, the entire American business community kept very quiet and quietly encouraged Donald Trump to continue his trade war with China. And of course, there's no doubt that there has been theft of intellectual property. There was forcible technology transfer, not a level playing field. So I think many of these allegations, and by the way, these allegations are not private. You can go to the website of the American Chamber of Commerce in either Shanghai or Beijing, and they document all their concerns that they have. And I think it's in China's interest to address these concerns. But when it comes to issues like theft of intellectual property, it's important to understand that all great powers, when they are rising, steal intellectual property. And Exhibit A is United States of America. And a friend of mine called Robert Hometz has published an article in the Harvard Business Review documenting how in the 19th century, the United States stole a lot of intellectual property from the British, because the British were the #1 economy and the United States was emerging. But once the United States started producing enough intellectual property, the United States went from being the thief to becoming the custodian of intellectual property. So in the same way, today, China is actually producing as much intellectual property as the United States in many areas. And China is now in China's national interest to protect intellectual property. So I think the Chinese will be ready to accept the higher standards. So there has been now a convergence of interest between United States, China, and other Western countries to protect intellectual property. So in that area, I see them cooperating with each other.
Mm-hmm. What do you see the likelihood of China joining the CPTPP?
Well, I don't think they can join anytime soon, partly for geopolitical reasons, because I think I have no evidence of this. I think Japan will be under pressure from the United States not to allow China into CPTPP because it would make China's influence even greater in East Asia. By the way, it was already great under RCEP, make it even greater under CPTPP. But I think at some point in time, if the trade, for most of the CPTPP countries, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was designed to help the United States retain its economic influence in the fastest growing economic region in the world. President Barack Obama was very wise to propose it. And by the way, Vice President Joe Biden supported it when he was vice president. So the United States should come back and rejoin the TPP. But if the United States cannot come back to join, and the CPPT countries continue to trade more with China, then they have an interest in getting China to abide by the higher standards of the CPTPP. So Japan will face two conflicting considerations. On the geopolitical side, the United States will tell Japan, don't agree. But for its own interests, Japan should agree, because Japan wants China to abide by the higher standards of the CPTPP. So you can see these conflicting interests at play in this question. So all issues of trade are never straightforward about economics or trade. There's always a geopolitical dimension in them that you also got to pay attention to.
Well, there are also quite a number of readers who are concerned about Xinjiang, because of course we know that the West has been accusing China of serious human rights violations in Xinjiang, and they believe that you have some insights that you can share with them about Xinjiang. I'm not sure whether you want to talk about.
Sure. I mean, I think I discussed Xinjiang in my book, by the way.
Oh, okay.
In my last chapter, and I point out the case that the question is, what is the goal of the United States and the West? What is the goal of the West? If the goal of the West is to help the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the best way to help them is not to make it a political issue, right? To actually have a dialogue with China and to say, hey, what can we do to improve the condition of the Uyghurs? But the minute you politicize it and use it as an instrument to embarrass China, then the Chinese won't have a dialogue with you. And I would say objectively, when, that someone, when there was a wonderful, sometimes in one line, you can capture the paradoxes or the hypocrisies of countries. They say, this one line said, United States doesn't like Muslims. United States doesn't like China. But United States likes Muslims in China. Now, that's a very simple statement that captures a paradox. Because paradoxically, if you look in terms of relations between China and the Islamic world and United States and the Islamic world, it's United States that has had more difficulties dealing with the Islamic world. In my last chapter, I say that the United States accuses China of detaining 800,000 Uyghurs in China. But the United States, in many of the illegal wars, according to Brown University, has killed 800,000 Muslims. So really, do you want to say that I know better how to handle Muslims? And when the United States and the West wrote a letter to the UN Human Rights Council on Xinjiang, expressing concerns about the Muslims in China, not one Muslim country signed the letter. So the question the rest of the world has to ask is this: should we listen to the Western countries on issues of Muslims, or should we listen to the Muslim countries on issues involving Muslims? And as you know, the Western record in the Islamic world is disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. And the United States has spent $5 trillion fighting unnecessary wars in the Islamic world. Actually, if you look at it in the long run, I predict 20 to 30 years from now, United States and China will actually be having a dialogue together on how we create peace and stability in the Islamic world. And there's actually a convergence of interests between China and United States in that area. But right now, you don't see the convergence because the number one priority of the United States is to embarrass China. Mm-hmm. So any issue that they can use to embarrass China, they will use. And so Xinjiang is used as an instrument to embarrass China.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a better way for China to handle the Xinjiang issue on the global stage?
Well, I think what they should do, and they have begun doing this, they've been inviting many of the Muslim countries to visit Xinjiang and to meet the people in Xinjiang. And I would say that we should get the Muslim countries to have a dialogue with China and then come out and explain to the rest of the world what they see is happening with the Muslims in China.
Mm-hmm. So to be much more transparent.
Yeah, they can be transparent, sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's another reader talking about the WHO. He feels that the WHO had actually lost credibility on the way they have, when they went into China to do investigation, they did not actually do a good enough investigation on the Wuhan lab. What is your view on this? That's the World Health Organization has sort of lost credibility on the global stage, and so the Biden administration has to come in to actually take over.
Well, I'm very glad that the question of World Health Organization was raised because, I've written several books, including one book called The Great Convergence. And I describe how the World Health Organization has been progressively weakened over the last 30 to 40 years. Now, I think your reader will be very surprised to discover that the country that has weakened the World Health Organization over the last 30 to 40 years is not China, but it's the United States and the West. and I give a concrete piece of evidence provided by a lady, Professor Kelly Lee, who wrote a book on the World Health Organization. In the 1970s, 60 to 70% of the budget of the World Health Organization came from compulsory assessed contributions. And only 28% came from voluntary contributions, right? So, and why are compulsory contributions important? Because if you want to recruit health inspectors, right? Good health inspectors, you got to give them a lifetime career in the World Health Organization. To give them a lifetime career in the World Health Organization, you can only pay them from assessed contributions, not voluntary contributions, which changes every year. And you know what's happened since then? Now, only 18% of the World Health Organization budget comes from compulsory contributions. 80% comes from voluntary contributions. That distorted the whole World Health Organization. And the West did this. I've documented this in great detail. So when the West complains about the World Health Organization being weakened, they never mention, oh, we weakened the World Health Organization. So I think the West should be intellectually honest and admit that it made a mistake in weakening these organizations, and not just the World Health Organization, also the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and our other agencies. So the West should switch its policy from weakening multilateral institutions to strengthening them. And you know, in that book, Great Convergence, I quoted from a speech that Bill Clinton gave in 2003 in Yale. Please read that speech. He says, if the United States is going to be #1 forever, then fine, it can carry on doing what it's doing. It can be unilateral, do what it wants, and so on and so forth. Then he adds a but he said, if the United States can conceive of a world where it's no longer the military, political, economic superpower in the world, then surely it's in the United States' interest to strengthen multilateral rules, norms, and processes. And I know, I've been involved with the UN for 30 years. I know how the West has been weakening the United Nations. I know how the United States has been weakening the United Nations. And I think now the West has got to wake up. It is no longer in the interest of the West to weaken multilateral institutions. It's no longer in the interest of the West to weaken the World Health Organization. It's now in the interest of the West to strengthen the World Health Organization, especially after COVID-19. But for this to happen, it is the West that's got to make a U-turn in its policies. And I encourage the West to make a U-turn because it serves long-term Western interests. I'm asking the West to do something that is in Western interests. Right? This is why I keep saying, I'm trying to help the West do what is good for the West.
So in that sense, does it mean that there's a vacuum now? That no one is capable of doing this investigation?
No, I think I will still rely on the World Health Organization. It is still the World Health Organization is still the most trusted organization in the world, despite all its limitations and all that. And I think the scientists of the world will be happy to work with the World Health Organization.
Okay. Another reader, he asked the question, for Singapore, should small states behave like small states?
Tell him, that's a very dangerous question. No, I think the lesson of history is always the case that when great powers fight, right, the small states will suffer.
Yeah.
That's very, very clear. And so it's very important that small states must be very careful, very agile, and be ready to shift and adjust. Because, there's an old Sri Lankan proverb, right? I'm sure you heard of that. When elephants fight, the grass suffers. When elephants make love, the grass also suffers. So, for example, as you know, throughout the Cold War, United States and Soviet Union were at loggerheads. United States and China are good friends, right? So, and so right now, it's United States and China at loggerheads. Let's say maybe 30 years from now, something amazing happens. India becomes the #1 power. then United States and China will become friends against India, right? That's how great powers behave. So great powers will always put their interests first. And what small states, the intelligent small states, do is adjust, stay out of the way, and not be used as the battering ram by any great power against the other great power. But fortunately, I would say Singapore has, really, since I'm no longer in the Singapore Foreign Service, I can say that we still have one of the best foreign services in the world. So I have great confidence that our foreign service will be giving good advice on how we manage this contest.
Okay. So one more question. When you were writing a book, there was no COVID-19. How do you think COVID-19 has changed things?
Well, in many ways, I think COVID-19 sadly proved that my thesis was correct. Because if the logical thing for United States and China to have done in response to COVID-19 is that since COVID-19 was an enemy of China, and since COVID-19 is an enemy of United States and China should have said, okay, let's pause our fight. Let's combine, destroy COVID-19, then we can come back and fight each other. That would be the logical, sensible thing for United States and China to do, right? Unfortunately, both United States and China decided to prove that my book was correct. So my book said that the driving force in global affairs will be the U.S. China geopolitical contest. And COVID-19 unfortunately proved it. Because even when they should have cooperated with each other, they didn't cooperate with each other. And that was a tragedy for the world, by the way. Because the Trump administration just wanted to use COVID-19 to embarrass China as much as possible, calling it the China virus, the Wuhan virus, and also, frankly, one of the most sensitive things I raise in my book is the yellow peril dimension that we haven't spoken about, which I hope that the readers of my book will pay attention to. Because it's in some ways the emotional yellow peril dimension is a key factor also in the U.S.-China relationship. So COVID-19, unfortunately, proved that my book analysis was correct.
All right, Prof. Mahbubani, before I end today's session, would you like to say a few words about the Chinese edition? It's going to be available in China, and how do you think the Chinese will respond to your book? Because I believe you mentioned just now that a number of your books previously was published in China as well.
Well, as you know, when we were discussing earlier, I told you I don't speak or read Chinese. So I cannot follow what's happening in the Chinese social media or the Chinese literary scene. But I'm told by my friends that my Chinese name, Ma Kai Shaw, I believe, is very well known in China. And it is a fact that when I meet the Chinese leaders, some of them I have met before. I'll give you an example. The most senior official in Chinese Foreign Affairs is the State Counselor for Foreign Affairs, Yang Jiechi. I actually had the pleasure of hosting him to dinner in my house in Singapore when he was Vice Foreign Minister and just before he became Foreign Minister. And over the years, of course, when I served as ambassador to the UN, I had very good relations with my Chinese counterparts. And I've actually been invited back several times to China by various Chinese think tanks and Chinese institutions. And very often in private, they will say to me, Kishore, don't tell us about the good things we have done. Tell us about the mistakes we have made. Because we want to learn from you on the mistakes we made, because that's what we want to correct, And that to me showed a great deal of openness. And I'm still waiting for Washington, D.C. to invite me to say, please come and tell us what mistakes we have made. But to be fair, at the same time, I publish most of my books in the United States. So the United States is very acutely aware of what I've said. But my goal, as I emphasize, is to help the United States, help China. And at the end of the day, the goal of my book, especially as you can see in the last chapter, is to persuade both the United States and China to stop this geopolitical struggle and focus on improving the well-being of their people. So if they focus on improving the well-being of their people, then my book would have achieved its mission.
All right. Thank you, Professor Mahbubani. Well,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Our book sharing session would have to end now. And thank you everyone for watching and listening in. And thank you to our interpreters. Professor Mahbubani, you have been very generous with your thoughts and reflections today. And I want to thank you on behalf of us and also the Chinese Media Group for your participation and your sharing. Stay safe and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.